Okay, guys, so we are still on slide 7, and we're talking about the conceptualization of internet overuse as non-pathological. And by that, doesn't mean that it's not problematic. What researchers mean by this and professionals mean by this is instead of it really being part of an existing disorder, it could potentially be a manifestation of its own disorder category, and a way of managing difficult problems, compensating for difficult emotions or problems in one's own life, but that it's not just part of an existing category like OCD or impulse control disorders or addictive disorders. That's what we mean here, not that it's not problematic. So let's talk a little bit about this. You can see on the slide that when we're talking about this sort of non-psychopathological approach in the way that it's meant, we're talking about internet addiction as a compensatory strategy. And in particular, compensating for what? Like, what does that mean? It's a compensation. What are you compensating for by overuse of the internet? The idea is that a person has difficult, negative, adverse life situations, and those create very uncomfortable, problematic emotions such as depression or anxiety. And they're going online then to compensate for being unable to manage those emotions or even the problems that created those emotions in the first place. So the idea is that the internet use is a reaction, a compensation strategy, a coping mechanism, if you will, that was triggered by negative life circumstances. And so these negative life circumstances that create uncomfortable and difficult emotions could be permanent or temporary, right? So permanent, it could be things like a physical handicap or disability that the person is trying to live with and having a lot of difficulty incorporating into his or her self-image. It's creating depression and anxiety, and they're going on the internet to try to manage that and compensate for that. In less severe cases, it could mean just a few hours of compensatory internet use is beneficial and leads to few problematic outcomes. Maybe you're just having a stressful week, for example. That's temporary. And you're using the internet to alleviate your stress that week, not because you're not going to confront the reasons you're having stress, not because it's a permanent solution to a problem, but it's just a temporary way of providing yourself some relief. And so this non-psychopathological approach says, look, all internet overuse, so to speak, is not necessarily indicative of a disorder. It's not necessarily clinically relevant. It could be, right? But how it starts, whether it becomes clinically relevant or not, could be the same reason. It could be someone's trying to manage uncomfortable life circumstances or emotions, and this is a way for them to do that. If that becomes their only strategy, if that takes over other aspects of their lives and they're not dealing with the reason for those uncomfortable emotions, then it could potentially become a clinically relevant problem. So just to talk a little bit more about this, the best way to think about this is the compulsive internet use becomes an escape mechanism. And maybe people are using that escape mechanism to avoid real problems, like, let's say, a sudden death in the family that's creating grief, or a job loss, or think about COVID, right? This has caused a lot of disruption in people's lives, and the only thing they can do to escape in many ways is the internet. Maybe that's become a strategy to compensate for how COVID has impacted lives. Or sometimes it could be perceived problems, such as identity issues. Sometimes people see themselves as inferior, as, not good enough, as not attractive enough, as whatever. And because they perceive those things to be flaws and problems in their lives, they use the internet as an escape mechanism from those perceived inadequacies. We do know that people who have so-called addictive personalities, although I will say what in psychology is not controversial. I will say even the idea of an addictive personality is controversial. I mentioned that in a prior class too. But so-called addictive personalities, right? And you remember I talked about this, are more likely to suffer from negative thinking patterns. And if they're more likely to suffer from negative thinking patterns, then they're more likely to have a need regularly in their lives to escape what kinds of uncomfortable emotions those negative thoughts create. So you think about, I'm not good enough, I'm not good enough, I'm not good enough, I'm not good enough. You're having that ruminative thought over and over and over again. That creates sort of a constant flow of depressive and anxious emotions. And then you might be more likely to get embroiled in something in a compulsive way to escape those more chronic feelings of depression and anxiety created by your chronic thoughts of being inadequate. This low self-esteem, these pessimistic attitudes, it helps people like that to have sort of this anonymous interaction over the internet, because whatever self-imposed inadequacies you create, your online persona can be different, right? And think about all the ways in which people often present their life online versus their real life. That's why, people often joke, oh, your Facebook life or your Instagram life, right? Because people can sort of escape the inadequacies and people can escape the inadequacies they perceive in themselves in their lives with these sort of online personas and false, so to speak, or enhanced or exaggerated lives. This appears to be especially true for young people. When we didn't have the internet, there were other means of escaping these kinds of thoughts and feelings that might make people feel inadequate or depressed or anxious. Poetry, music, sports, right? We sublimate, so to speak. When we sublimate, we take things that we might have difficulty dealing with and push them into other activities, right? So when we didn't have the internet, people turned to art, music, poetry, sports to try to deal with these aspects of themselves in their lives that they might have difficulty with. And not that we don't do that anymore at all, but we have the online world now to do a lot of that sublimation and compensate for what we don't like about ourselves or our lives or our identity flaws, so to speak. And so this escapism leads a person over time, if they do this repeatedly, to kind of depart from any unpleasant reality in their real life. And they create this sort of virtual ideal self that, for lack of a better word, kind of frees them, right? It frees them from feeling sort of trapped in the realities of who they are and the life that they're leading. And then that motivation to keep going online for this false self or ideal self or virtual self becomes greater and greater and greater and greater and greater, because it enhances their lives and enhances their identity and helps them escape repeatedly from the realities of their life and themselves that they don't want to deal with or can't deal with. Now, the research suggests that this escapism idea is most well researched in online excessive gaming, that internet gaming disorder category that I was talking about earlier. And researchers have studied the relationship between internet addiction, specifically with online gaming, and how people use that to alleviate psychological, social, and emotional problems, and how that motivates their use. It appears to be the case that for a lot of people who are excessively involved in online gaming, it's that anonymity in online environments that helps these people who have high anxiety, high depression, and a lot of loneliness in their real lives to compensate by constantly engaging in these mutual gameplay scenarios online where they feel like they're part of an environment, a virtual group. And if they're good at the game, by the way, then that enhances their sense of self because they're awesome at this game. They're doing better than everyone, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. People are trying to beat their scores and yada, yada, yada. In a 2014 study, a researcher by the name of, this is a long one, a researcher by the name of Cardefelt-Winther showed that the relationship between stress and online gaming seems to be driven by a motivation to escape, right? So the idea is, we talked about mediators. This is a mediator, the need to escape. The reason stress and online gaming are positively correlated, meaning the more stress people report, the more they engage in online gaming, especially young people. That correlation is mediated by a need to escape. So people experience stress. That stress causes a desire to escape that stress. And then that desire to escape causes greater participation in online gaming. Remember, mediators and moderators are different, and I'm not going to regurgitate all of it because I talked about it a lot in a prior class. Remember, a mediator is a causal link in a chain. It explains why two things are related, whereas a moderator explains the conditions under which two things are related more strongly or less strongly, if at all. In this case, we're talking about a mediator, escapism as a mediator. Similar findings have been determined in other studies. People, especially who play frequently in massive multiple player online games, or have tons of people engaging in this game from all over the place, maybe even all over the world, and especially role-playing games. So you think about that one, people can escape who they really are and pretend to be somebody else online in these multiplayer role-playing games to help escape depression, anxiety, loneliness, low self-esteem, etc., thoughts of inadequacy. What these findings suggest is that research should look at motivations for excessive internet gaming online and what psychosocial variables are correlated with that. Are we finding repeatedly it's people who, for example, are lonely? Is it people who report having very few friends in their real life? Is it people who report high levels of depression and anxiety or low self-esteem, right? That would give us a window into understanding this behavior. We also know from some research that people who have heightened levels of social anxiety, they're uncomfortable in actual real presence of other people, seem to use internet communication, internet gaming, as a way to interact without sort of the threat of actual real presence and potential rejection. You can control your image online, and you therefore lower your risk of negative evaluation. And that could lead to overuse and eventually internet addiction, as it's called, right? It really does seem to be the case that people who are being considered internet addicts do struggle a lot with their actual real life identity and sense of self, sense of adequacy, and self-esteem. And so if you can go online and change personas, if you can be the ideal version of yourself online, then that is a way to escape the inadequacy and the feelings that come with that inadequacy, like depression and anxiety. It also gives people an opportunity to feel less lonely and emotionally close to other people without worrying about getting close to people and being rejected in real life, so to speak, and that kind of fills a void in their lives, right? Last but not least, I want to mention there's not as much research on this, but some researchers have suggested that individuals may become compulsively involved in internet use and so-called internet addicts because of body image problems, which is sort of a specific type of low self-esteem, inadequacy. Maybe they're afraid of real life actions because they don't want people to see what they look like. And so if their appearance creates that much stress and embarrassment and fear of meeting other people, then they can go online and they can protect themselves from that fear of rejection because they don't like how they literally look. We also know from some studies that internet addiction can be secondary to and result from compulsive consumption of online pornography. And so maybe for some people, what's being referred to as internet addiction is really a form of, quote, sex addiction, using internet as a medium, as you know from our sex addiction lectures. But of course, this is a bit confusing because neither sex addiction nor internet addiction are actually recognized addictions in the DSM-5, although folks are treating it and acting as if it is. That's a lot of information. So I'm going to stop here. Whew! I feel like I ran a marathon. I said a lot, a mouthful. I feel like I'm spitting out words. I'm going to stop there. That's the end of slide 7. We will meet up again on slide number, let's say 5, 8. Slide number 8. Catch you soon.